Okay, great. Good evening, good afternoon. Thank you everyone for joining us for another interesting event that is part of Opatija Coffeehouse Debates program. This is a long-lasting 10-year program focusing on the popularization of science and the promotion of deliberative democratic culture. And this project has hosted many interesting talks and presentations from various international and domestic experts, and it is a great pleasure and privilege of mine to be able to introduce our speaker for today. This is Professor Alasia Nuti from the University of York, a well-known expert in the field of political philosophy, but also political science, I think a little bit of international relations, an author of several influential books and a lot of wonderful research articles. I'm reading one right now, like 10-15 minutes ago I was skimming through. A well-known scholar and an expert in the field, and she's going to talk about what liberals should do in face of the rise of far right. The title of her talk, Citizens' Responsibility in the Face of Rise of Far Right, is inspired by her previous work, but also inspired by many contemporary issues going on around the world in liberal democracies, well-established democracies, and also in rising democracies, because the far-right threat is not something specific only to new democracies, but also rises in some old and well-established ones. It is also my pleasure and privilege to introduce our discussants. Just to clarify, discussants are not here to lead the discussion, they are just to facilitate the discussion, maybe ask a question or two, because most of the discussion will be led by you, the participants. Our discussants for today are Megan Foster from Lewis University in Rome and Elio Baccarini from the University of Rijeka. Thank you very much for joining us. Before I leave the floor to Alasia, just a very brief thank you to the town of Opatija and to the county of Primorje and Gorski Kotar who are supporting this project for more than 10 years, as well as to our partners from the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences and Amadria Park Hotels who are helping us organize this set of events. So without further ado, we have around 30, 40, 45 minutes for your talk, and then around 45 minutes for general discussion. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much. I've never had a microphone in my hand, and it must resist the temptation to turn into a pop star, because I'm sure that you won't enjoy my singing skills, so just stick with my political philosophy, okay, stuff. So today I want to talk to you about the liberal citizens' responsibilities in the face of the far right. So by liberal citizen, what I mean is citizens that are committed to some version of like liberal rights. So I'm not here talking about a specific type of liberalism, but the sense of like citizens who think of people as free and equal. So what citizens should do in the face of the rise of the far right. So why is this question pressing, right? Of course, right, we are living under times where the far right, whether we like it or not, is particularly popular, right? Now, by far right, I mean a different constellation of political parties that are not just traditionally right-wing, okay? So you can think about the case of Brothers of Italy and the League in Italy, the case of the AfD in Germany, the National Rally in France, the Party for Freedom in the Netherlands, Fidesz in Hungary, and of course, right, Donald Trump in the US. We can talk a bit about what these parties have in common later on in the discussion. But of course, this list, right, shows how pressing the issue of the rise of what we can call a liberal, the question about citizens' responsibility for the rise of the far right is a very complicated one. And this is because liberalism, as a tradition, has been particularly reluctant to ask a lot from citizens, right? So compared to other traditions in political thought, like republicanism, liberalism has always tried to protect some spheres of life for citizens, where citizens are not even citizens, right? Are just individuals with their hobbies, their preferences, their activities. So liberals have been quite wary of asking too much in terms of political participation, in terms of activism from citizens. However, I also believe that this is a time for active citizenship, right? So if you are a liberal and you are worried about the rise of the far right, it's also the time to revise your understanding of citizenship and start asking more from citizens. In particular, what I will try to argue and discuss with you this evening is that I think that citizens need to engage with supporters of the far right. Now, you might agree with me, right, at this point, that some form of engagement is necessary, and you may have had some similar experience to the ones that I had of friends, relatives, people you know, but at some point they kind of turn to the far right, and you kind of ask yourself, okay, what shall I do, right? How should I engage with, let's say, a close friend from high school who suddenly started supporting Matteo Salvini, right, and the League. So that happened to me, so it's something that I feel quite strongly about. So, if you agree that some form of engagement is necessary and that we can't simply not do anything as liberal citizens in the face of the rise of the far right, you may ask what we should do. So, recently, Robert Alesie, a prominent political philosopher, has actually argued that we are already overdoing democracy. So Alesie is actually very worried about the fact that in contemporary societies, and Alesie is thinking especially about the United States, but you can also generalize to other contexts, many of those spaces that are social spaces and that you think that should be outside the politics are becoming saturated from politics. So family gatherings, the classical example of Alesie is Thanksgiving, where you meet your family and you're just there to have a lovely time, and then your uncle starts talking about politics. And my God, you can't just not enter in the argument. You argue against this political position, and in just a matter of a couple of minutes, what was supposed to be an amazing family gathering, a peaceful, right, family gathering to celebrate peace and fraternity becomes a nightmare, right? So Alesie is really worried about that. And so his argument is that actually, in order to save democracy, citizens should engage with each other in a non-political way. Okay, so by collaborating with one another in cooperative endeavors. So, for example, going together and volunteer to clean a local park, doing things together but just not engage politically. So making a sort of commitment, right, to be together in these sort of spaces, doing things together, connecting with one another, but refusing to enter any political conversation. Now, Talise's point is not completely far-fetched. Okay? So Talise is really worried about what political scientists call affective polarization. Have you ever heard of the term affective polarization? So, generally, technically, polarization without the affective adjectives means that beliefs, political beliefs in the countries have polarized, right? So that in a country, the political ideas of citizens have become a bit more extreme and not really reconcilable. Affective polarization is different. It's not just that people have very, very different, right, political beliefs. It's that, in a sense, they really hate the other side, okay? So it's about your affect towards people who think about politics in a different way. Because you can think politically very differently, right, from one another. So I can have a very different, polarized political views in comparison to you, but I can still respect you, right, as a common citizen, or think that if your party wins the elections, there's still a kind of fair, procedurally democratic electoral result, right? With affective polarization, things change. And affective polarization is being shown to be particularly troubling for democracy, because it's been shown that actually people start hating the other political side so much that even if they are committed to democracy, they will be willing to have democracy take a hit in order to avoid the other side to win the election. So just to give you an example, in the context of the US, which is the context Alesie is particularly concerned about, some Republicans, okay, might hate so much Democrats that they will still vote for Trump, not because they like Trump, but because they don't want the Democrats to win, knowing that Trump will be bad for democracy. Right? But the most important thing is not democracy, it's for Democrats not to win. So that's affective polarization. Now, this type of engagement, right? So Alesie is arguing for a type of engagement, is arguing that as citizens we need to step up and engage with each other, but just stay out of views, beliefs, especially about politics. It's an interesting type of engagement, and in some cases it's been quite important as a form of engagement to prevent and tackle radicalization. So I'll give you an example of the de-radicalization of religious citizens. Okay? So in recent years, scholars who are interested in extremism and radicalization have been particularly concerned with two groups, right? One is the far right, which is the kind of case I have more expertise on, and the other is the kind of religious citizens, in particular Muslim citizens, then getting radicalized in so-called Western country and then join, for example, like ISIS fighters, right? So, in the case of the radicalization of religious citizens, engagement of the kind that Alesie is arguing for has been proven to be very important. So, Nafis Ahmed is a cognitive scientist. I really recommend you to listen to a podcast interviewing him. The podcast is called like Hidden Brain, where Ahmed talks about his work on researching basically radicalized Muslim Western, right, citizens in Western countries, to think about strategies for the radicalization. Now, Nafis Ahmed found out that actually, when it comes to the radicalization of religious citizens, religion, you may think unsurprising, but has nothing to do with it. It's not really a matter of you becoming more religious, right? More radicalized in your religious belief. The root cause of radicalization, in the case Amit is interested in, so like Islamic groups becoming more extreme, more radicalized, and then willing to take violent action, is social exclusion. So what he found out is that actually the most vulnerable people to radicalization are not people that are particularly religious, okay, from start. They're actually people who felt rejected from the majority group, right, from the larger community. So they felt kind of socially excluded, socially rejected, and then they had a kind of cascade of life events, like particularly unfortunate life events, and the combination of rejection from the majority group and unfortunate life events then led to radicalization. Like these sort of unfortunate life events could be like things like breaking up with their partner, being fired, or arguing with their family. But if you have this sort of unfortunate life event and you feel also socially excluded, then you will kind of be led to find some connection within another group that seems to protect you from the majority group that has rejected you. So, according to Amit, is the need to belong socially what drive people to get radicalized in this community. Again, religion has nothing to do with it, and because religion has nothing to do with it, de-radicalization cannot really go through a kind of religious engagement. So you don't de-radicalize basically someone who is willing is thinking about joining ISIS fighters by showing that actually being a Muslim is perfectly compatible with living in a liberal democracy. That's not going to work, because the problem is not religion, the problem is social exclusion. So according to Amit, de-radicalization is not about convincing that their religious ideas are wrong. De-radicalization is about offering social opportunities of a genuine inclusion, okay, into society. Now, Amit's understanding of de-radicalization in the case of religious citizens has been proven to be kind of really effective. So I'll give you two examples. So one is the so-called Aarhus model. So the Danish city of Aarhus has become quite famous for having what is called an holistic approach to counter-radicalization, right? To de-radicalization, preventing basically vulnerable Muslim young Danish citizens to get radicalized, or even to integrate back into society people who joined ISIS, right, and then came back. Now, the Aarhus model, again, has nothing to do with religion. So it's not about having conversation with these young people and convincing them that the text of the Quran doesn't really prescribe them what they think. It's about inclusion. So the Aarhus model is about offering a wide range of services to young people, from counseling to support with healthcare, education, employment, housing. It includes what is called the mentoring program, which is very important. So young citizens are assigned a mentor, which become a support figure, but also a role model to discuss anything, right? And sometimes religion might come up, right? But it's not the main aim of the program. Similarly, the city of Mechelen in Belgium has become quite an interesting case study in the literature. And this is because in a time when Belgium had lots of kind of homegrown ISIS terrorism, right? So people from Belgium then going to Afghanistan and Iraq to join extremist Islamist groups. Mechelen didn't send anyone, even if it's a big city with a large Muslim community. And so people started being very interested, of course, in this case and asking, why is the case, right? But Mechelen, in a country that is fueling that kind of radicalization, is so exceptional. And it turned out that Mechelen is so exceptional because he had a really planned program of social cohesion, trying to engage everyone, especially young people, into local activities and local participation. It's a program that engages all its residents, okay, so not only targeting this Muslim community, and especially like young people, but really about forming this community. Now, this is a type of engagement, right, that doesn't really go through talking about politics and doesn't really go pass through talking about religion. And it's been really effective. But what we need to ask ourselves is whether this is what we need for the far right, okay? So there is a bit a tendency of thinking that when we talk about radicalization, okay, and extremism, the causes and the ways to tackle them are exactly the same. But we are talking about different phenomena, okay, which may have some things in common, but they are also different. So, will that work with the far right? Now, I'm not saying here that the type of engagement that Alesie is prescribing is of no value, right, or that we shouldn't do that. What I'm saying is that is not enough, that the stakes are too high here, okay, to think that that's gonna be enough. And this is because, of course, social exclusion is an important cause of the rise of the far right, but it's not the only one. This is a much more complex phenomenon. So staying completely out of politics, when the problem is also politics, might not work. We might have to, okay, have those uncomfortable conversations at the family gathering with your uncle, who you love, right? But my God, is now voting for Meloni, okay? So you will need to have a conversation, basically. So you will need to put pressure to your uncle, okay? Whether that might be uncomfortable for you or not. Okay, so in my joint work with Gabriele Badano, who some of you may know from last year, we argue that liberal citizens have a duty of pressure in the case of the rise of the far right. So by duty of pressure, we mean that liberal citizens need to discursively engage with supporters of the far right they know, right? So family, friends, colleagues, people that you just know, and persuade them to change their mind. Now, we are not so naive, okay, to think that the way to do that is to sort of really rationalistically prove that they are wrong, okay? That's not how politics work, okay? Maybe we wish, some of us may wish that, philosophy will save the world, but, after a while of being a philosopher, I sort of realize that might not be the case, okay? So people are moved politically not only, not mainly, by philosophical and rationalistic arguments. The trick needs to be different, okay? So what we argue is for liberal citizens to tap into rhetoric and rhetorical strategies to engage with supporters of far-right politics that they know. Now, rhetoric historically has a bad reputation for liberals. Many liberals think that rhetoric is kind of synonymous with manipulation, because persuasion needs to pass through reason, persuade others through the involvement of rational capacity. But rhetoric actually is much more than that, right? I mean, after all, politics is importantly about rhetoric. And rhetoric, as some scholars like Brian Garsten have shown, can be actually a very respectful way to engage with interlocutors, because it's about talking with others from where they are, starting from their passions, their interests, their identities, rather than bracketing them. Okay? So there is some type of rhetoric that, in particular, that is not manipulative, but actually can lead to a respectable way of persuade others. One type of rhetorical strategy is what is called reasoning from analogies. Now, a famous linguistic, George Lakoff, famously has argued that people think in an analogical way when they think about politics, okay? It's through comparing things, through metaphors, through analogies, when people think about political issues. Now, what will mean to use an analogy in an engagement with a supporter of the far right? So, I'll give you an example. Let's imagine that you are Francesca, a liberal citizen who is friend to Marco, someone who is now voting for the Italian far-right party, the League. Okay? So one of the fantastic policies proposed back in 2015 by Matteo Salvini, the leader of the League, was to ban the construction of new mosques, okay, in Italy. Okay. This is a typical policy targeting, of course, like Muslim minorities in Italy. So Francesca knows that Marco is a Catholic, and in her engagement with Marco, she might draw an analogy, okay, between Salvini's proposal of banning the construction of new mosques in Italy with the treatment of Christian and Catholic minorities in, let's say, Saudi Arabia. And ask Marco, look, Marco, of course you are against the treatment of Christian citizens in Saudi Arabia. So if you are against that kind of discriminatory treatment there, you should think that Salvini is wrong. Okay? This analogy between Salvini proposals, okay, and the treatment of Catholic citizens in Saudi Arabia is an analogy. And by being analogy, all the steps of the argumentative process are not made explicit, right? So here is not that Francesca is really showing that you can prove that the type of discrimination is exactly the same. But she's sort of throwing an image, okay, to Marco, that Marco can effectively relate to. Another example of rhetorical strategies that we think about when you talk about the duty of pressure is what it's been called appeal to trusted authorities. So scholars of deliberative democracy, like Simon Chambers, argue that in our complex society, it's very difficult for citizens to kind of become expert about everything. At some point, you will need to rely on the authority of someone you trust, you believe, to make a decision, right? So you might not become, let's say, an expert of public transportation policy, but because you really trust, let's say, a politician, you will just follow what they say, okay? And that's actually normal in our complex society. So let's go back to Francesca and Marco. If you remember, Marco is Catholic, so for him a very trusted authority is the Pope. Okay, and when we wrote this book, there was still the previous Pope. Okay, so we will have to see what happens with this one. But Pope Francis, okay, was someone who really stood up against the politics of the far right in Italy and across the world. And you may want to say, look, how can you vote Salvini or think that Salvini is right when it comes to migration, when it comes to engagement with other religions, when Pope Francis has encouraged interreligious dialogue and so on? Okay, this might seem a bit sketched, okay, I admit that. But how we can make the duty of pressure work, right? How can it be effective? So, Anand Girindar's Indie Persuaders, which is a book that I really strongly recommend, interviews different type of activists who spend their life trying to persuade others. And she tries to understand what works. So, first of all, she argues that something like the duty of pressure, which remember it's about liberal citizens trying to put pressure on supporters of the far right they know, might actually work because you trust the people who are talking to you and they are putting pressure on you. She says, when your friend, your cousin, your neighbor posts something on their Facebook page, it's more persuasive than when you hear that same content in the head or from someone else, because of the level of suspicion. Okay? There is a kind of relationship of trust between you and your friend, which gives you some authority, okay? Which is really, really important for this type of engagement. But it's not only that. She argues that when it comes to persuasion, and she's quite concerned with the type of engagement that we are talking about, right? So with the persuading people to think differently politically, what is key is repetition, okay? So before I presented you with the case of Marco and Francesca, what I'm saying is not that Francesca will convince Marco by just throwing an analogy right there. I'm not saying you that Francesca will convince Marco by appealing to Marco's trusted authorities. What I'm saying is that having lots of Francesca keeping engaging with Marco and repeating the same political message, pushing different buttons, pressing him from different angles, and repeating that all and all over again might do the trick. So Girinders argues, but keep repeating the message at work, on the subway, at the Sunday family dinner, it's key. And it's key because what you need is creating a noise, okay? It's creating a noise around Marco, right, or the Marco you know, making him think that so many people he trusts is in a relation with, they are repeating the same thing, and then maybe he will need to reconsider his views. Now, for the duty of pressure to work, citizens need to be helped and supported by other political actors that are more powerful than citizens, and in particular by political parties. Of course, the rise of the far right is also a failure of mainstream political parties to have captured the attention, to have listened to the needs of a big portion of the electorate. Okay? So, in the same book, The Persuaders, what it's argued is that political parties committed to liberal democratic ideals, liberal democratic values, need to change their frames. So first of all, they need to go for bold visions, bold claims. So for a very long time, liberal democratic parties, for example, the Democrats in the US, you can think about the Democratic Party in Italy, have kind of chased a kind of fantastic voter that doesn't exist anymore. Okay, they've chased the so-called moderate middle, right? Try to kind of persuade people who are moderate, trying to propose political frames, political visions that are not too bold in order not to alienate moderates, you know. So you can think about all the discussion in the US among Democrats about, you know, being careful with socio-economic justice because that might be too extreme, and so on. Now, the kind of moderate voter does not really exist anymore. We live in times of polarization when people actually need bolder ideas, but also the way in which liberal democratic parties have tried to chase the moderate voter is been trying to propose things that are a bit in the middle, that neither fish nor meat, and that they just don't move politically. So the way in which this is put in the Persuaders, and I think it is quite an effective way, is that if you are moderate, if you are undecided, let's say, between having a pizza and having a burger for dinner, you are not gonna want to have a pizza burger, okay? So you are undecided between pizza and burger. What you really want is really a sort of pizza with some burger on it, or what you want is someone persuading you that having pizza is better than having burger. Okay? You want one of the two bold things. You don't want to have a sandwich, a kind of Frankenstein of the two. So you need to be bold as a political party to get back support that you lost from far-right parties. Second, what is mentioned in the persuader, which is really important, is try to avoid keep referring to problems, complaints about what doesn't work. Offer an alternative vision. After all, right, Martin Luther King didn't persuade people by saying, I have a problem, I have a complaint. He persuaded people by saying, I have a dream, okay? So you need to paint a beautiful tomorrow that can really move and mobilize people rather than keep complaining about things that don't work. Offer alternatives. And then, the other important thing that political parties need to do is to change the conversation. This is something that is not being done, right? And I honestly don't know what political parties are waiting for, because this, what everyone in political science is saying, you need to change the conversation. You cannot beat the far right on their issue, okay? So what does it mean, changing the conversation? Changing the conversation, first of all, means not mimicking the far right on their policies, such as migration. So this sort of strategies is called in technical language copycatting. And this is when mainstream parties try to copy the rhetoric, the policies of the far right to gain support. This is a strategy that has been proven not to work, okay? So I think that honestly, as liberals, you should morally be kind of opposed to this sort of strategy, because mimicking the far right on, let's say, migration basically means normalizing a language of exclusion, a language of intolerance, and so on, which is very morally problematic. But even if you are not very much concerned with morality, as I might be, this strategy has been proven not to work. And the reason why it doesn't work is that by mimicking the far right on their issues like migration, what's happening is that those issues become even more political salient, so they are becoming the main issues that people have in mind, and if you're really concerned about migration, you're gonna vote far right, you're not gonna vote for a kind of a lukewarm version of it. You want the real thing, okay? But this is a strategy that even it's been proven not to work, it's been so tempting, right, to so many political parties. Even recently, in the UK, the Labour leader and the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, has really tried to mimic the language of the far right, and in particular the language of its competitor, Reform UK, led by Nigel Farage, on migration, right? With a speech which, I don't know, like it kind of was a really big thing in the UK. I don't know if you managed to hear about it, but it was a really horrible speech echoing, actually, a very famous speech given by Conservative leader Enoch Powell, which was called the Rivers of Blood, and it was all about the threat of migrants coming in our community, destroying our way of living, and so on. Okay. So Starmer has been accused of copycatting the far right, because the far right actually had a quite surprising success in the UK recently. This is morally problematic and it doesn't work. Now, ideally, what political parties should do to change the conversation is changing the political salience of issues, political issues. So instead of talking a lot about migration, talk about healthcare, talk about public housing, talking about having a permanent and safe employment, change the issues that should really matter to people. However, if you really have to talk about migration, okay, so if you are forced into discussing issues in the far-right agenda, what's been proven to be very important is to change the language in which these issues are discussed. So the example that is given in the Persuader, which I found very inspiring, is an example from the wake of the 9/11, right? When, of course, the concern was about the threat to security that supposedly Muslim citizens could pose. So, one frame that was actually very much used by Democrats engaging in this sort of discussion was saying that, look, the vast majority of Muslim citizens, of Muslim around the world, pose no threat to security. So this was a very kind of popular frame, right? Okay, not all Muslim, or actually the majority of Muslim people, are not a threat to security. What do you think that might be wrong with this frame? Anyone? Yeah?
There is a word of threat.
Okay, good.
It captured the attention.
Yeah. So basically, right, the problem with this frame is that what people hear is that, yes, Muslim people are a threat to security. Okay, so by saying that the vast majority of Muslims pose no threat to security, you are still linking Muslim people to a threat to security. This is not going to help. This is not going to change the conversation, because this keeps linking being Muslim with being a potential threat to security. What they say could have been a much better frame to engage with that type of issue would have been Muslim Americans are our neighbors, they are our co-workers, they are the kids in our schools, they are the parents in our parks. This is a frame that doesn't mention security and threat at all. It's a frame that invites you to think about Muslim Americans as yourself, right? As people who are concerned with your same daily things, right? Bringing kids to the park, bringing them to school, buying a grocery, and so on. This makes you think about Muslim Americans differently rather than a potential threat to security. All right, so I think that the note that I want to end with is that fighting with the far right is really a collective endeavor, and if you're interested in what I think about it, you might want to read the book that I wrote with Gabriele Badano. It's an endeavor that needs to involve many different political actors. But what I want to stress this evening, and what I would like to discuss with you, really genuinely, because I'm very interested to know what you think about it, is that citizen engagement is a crucial part of that endeavor. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Now, better. I'll leave this. Okay. Thank you so much, Alasia, for a very thought-provoking and inspiring talk. We have some time for discussion, and we're going to start with our two discussants. Although a small favor, don't take too long, because I'm sure we have a lot of questions from the audience. So ask one question and have one ready in case of silence, but I don't think that that's going to be the case. So we can start with, who wants to go first? With Megan? Okay.
Thank you very much, Alasia. It was very interesting to talk, and I've been looking forward to hearing what you have to say on this subject, and I think that I think everyone agrees that this is a crucial topic to be discussing and what actually can we do, unfortunately, in these times. One thing that jumped out at me that I was a little bit surprised is the idea that political parties should be making, well, okay, I'll start this by saying that the changing the conversation, I think that's absolutely crucial, and all this painting, also the painting the beautiful, vision of the future. I was a huge Obama supporter. The idea of hope, this was really something that got me, and I really I want to see more of this, the political value of hope, and so that was really. But then come to the idea that political parties have this obligation, or that what they can do to facilitate this idea that you have that can help us out in our, also with our duty to pressure would be. Yeah, this making bold claims, which to me, I thought that it would actually, I would think, sort of the opposite, trying to be more accommodating of the other party's perspective. Obviously, copycatting is something we should all see, especially when it's on something like migration issues. No one is, these parties, they're not copycatting on the socioeconomic things that the right might have gone right with their own. It's always in the sort of, this distasteful way, which I agree that we should, but that we should be, making claims that are sort of further apart. And I have the sensation, at least, and my knowledge is best of the U.S. case, but there's a certain extent to which what you call the effective polarization is stronger than the actual polarization, where there's this idea that we perceive, that everyone on the left is only fixated with identity issues that are very extreme and completely far away, and then on the other hand we think that the right is virtually Nazis, but actually when we look at exit poll data and what people really think and feel about policies, we're more or less closer together. We're much closer together than we perceive ourselves to be. So I think that my intuition is that there might still be a place for a more moderate position, at least, and again speaking at least from the U.S. case. So that was my main question.
Yeah. Or as you prefer.
Okay, one.
So yes. Oops. So yes, thanks, Megan. It's very interesting. Again, here I'm more, of course, basing myself to what other people have sort of investigated, right? And it seems like there is this worry about being brave, in a sense, in politics, which seems to be more dictated by a kind of belief that what people want is a kind of moderate position, rather than something that is bold and by movement, right? So, of course, the case of the US, the case of the effective polarization in the US is very peculiar, because in the US you have a two-party system, which in a sense kind of lends itself to this sort of effective polarization. So it might be even trickier. But I think that there is a failure of courage in political imagination committed by political leaders. And it looks like in this time many people don't want the kind of moderate thing, they want a change. So I think that what political parties, what we will call mainstream political parties, need to do is be braver in their visions rather than be more timid. But I appreciate that we might disagree on that.
Excellent. Okay.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Alasia. I read the book with enormous pleasure, and now I was hearing you with enormous pleasure. Still, philosophers like to disagree, so I have still some doubts. I think I'm more in sympathy with the Thalys idea than you expressed. I think that one important resource could be to organize people to be active together in cooperative endeavors, while refusing what they separate them. And this could be of different kind. So could be, as Thalys mentions, being engaging for some benefits for the community, like working on parks, things like this, caring about vulnerable people in the neighborhood, and so on and so forth. Also finding common passions together, for example, even with big political dissent, found unifying aspects, for example, in supporting the same football team, and things like this, possibly Inter, obviously. And okay, this is perhaps sometimes happen, an insight represented in an artwork. If I remember correctly, the title was American Generation X or something like this, with Ed Norton, who is kind of neo-Nazi in America, then had to cooperate with a person from another race, and then they became friends by finding. So I think this is an important resource, yes. So, how to say, I'm very much convinced about your idea of a duty to be engaged. And I don't think this demanding, even from a liberal standpoint, if you want to be coherent, because if a liberal state can require us to take weapons and fight to defend the country for a foreign aggression, for example, why can't require us to be engaged with much less dangerous situation to define the constitutional stability and the values of our country. But I think this must be taken cum grano salis, in the sense that if we are always there, we will always remain there in the divisions. Where, and just to finish the last few words, to remember the importance of loyalty to communities. So, as you surely know, there is this theory of cultural cognition of people like Dan Kehan, for example, but how happens that people trust in so enormous stupidities like science denialism? And then Kehan says, but it's to be loyal, to be recognized as loyal members of their community. So I think that Thalys' suggestion is very important. It could be summarized by the thought, form new communities, not only those that rigidly separate people in your society. So, last words, the sentence to the basic thought is, it's good due to pressure, but cum grano salis, considering this other strategy of Thalys that could be precious.
It's on, okay, perfect. Yes, so thanks, Salvio. Yes, I'm on board with this. So I think that the way in which I think about the duty of pressure and the way in which I think about Thalys' proposal about kind of saving democracy, so his type of engagement is a kind of complementary way. So I think that we need both. I think that Thalys on its own might not be enough. So you also need sometimes to put pressure. But I do recognize the importance of that kind of engagement. So again, in the book, so you know that I'm advertising that a lot this evening, so apologies for that. So we argue that, for example, municipalities have an important role in doing that kind of engagement. So by municipality here I mean any kind of subnational administrative unit, so you can think about cities, towns, regions, states, depending on the particular constitutional context. But those kind of entities that have some kind of power, they have some kind of jurisdiction, are really crucial in the fight against the far right. And especially cities and towns have been very proactive with a type of engagement that is really similar to what Alesie is prescribing. So thinking about basically activities that bring together people from very different backgrounds, different religions, different cultures, and don't talk about their religion and cultures, make them do things together. So, for example, cook together, or playing sport together, right? So sport is been seen as actually very crucial to make people see themselves as more equal, right? So the trick is making people collaborate in a kind of joint venture, make them do things together, and then they will actually realize that after all, yeah, they may have a different religion, they may have a different culture, but we are not so different. We can work together, we can do things together, even if we are different. And as I was saying, like cities and towns have been very proactive in that way. So I think that actually that kind of engagement is something that I recognize as being very important, even if I talk about that in my work more about something that other agents like municipalities can be really well placed to do. But yeah, I agree. I think the two are complementary. But I'm not convinced that with, by Alesie bold claim in this case that we should always stay out of politics.
Great, thank you. So we are now open for discussion. I already have 3 hands up. So I will start from this very active table here. But for the others, get your hands up. There is still plenty. 4? Was it hand up? Yeah. Okay, so 4 at this table. But for the others, get your hand up. There is still enough time. The order is the following.
Hi. I just want to say that I don't believe that everyone who voted for Meloni or Le Pen or even ADF is far righter. I think that they see something in those political options which either more moderate party just does not provide or don't want to provide for some reason, or they have a general disbelief in the entire political system. But my question is, if we start with that, if with your approach of pressure everywhere on every point, how much is likely that person will feel socially excluded by that pressure and actually going on and become even more extreme because they are the only one that will accepting them?
Maybe you can just say that.
Oh, yes, sorry, yes. Okay, so yeah, thanks, that's very interesting. So I think that when you think about the duty of pressure in action, it's in a sense a kind of balance, right? So I think that, so first of all, I'm not saying that, you or everyone else, right, exercising the duty of pressure should put pressure necessarily like every time in every occasion, right? So the claim about repetition is important, but it's not to say that you always have to put pressure, right? Precisely because you know the person you are engaging with politically, you also know individually when it's time to stop, right? You know when you have the attention of your ankle, or you know that maybe you don't have the attention of your ankle because your ankle still sees you as a little girl playing with dolls, but you have the attention of your grandfather, right? So it's about exploiting the kind of individualized knowledge you have of your interlocutor. Now, I see the point of the risk of repetition being a drive into feeling socially excluded. I think that what it said, especially the persuaders, about the importance of repetition, is that in a sense it's a repetition of a certain kind. It's a repetition by people you trust, you love, you have a relationship with. So people you have an interest in listening to, okay? It's not just repetition per se, but it's really been proven that it's important that the message is repeated over time. So that you need to have a kind of noise around you that somehow kind of triggers your attention and makes you think differently. So yeah, I see your point, it's very interesting, thank you.
Next speaker.
Thanks a lot for this. Thanks. So this is very good. I think I agree with a lot of the things you've said. I do want to bring up 2 points. I think I want to extend on something Meg said regarding moderate views and moderate proposals. So I think one extension that might be problematic to me is like you said, there might be a problem with copycatting what the right-wingers are doing, and this an attempt to be more radical or more brave, more kind of, just harder about a particular proposal might be seen as a type of copycatting what the right wing is doing. And there's an additional, I think, danger just strategically that if you go for a more kind of a brave or radical left-wing proposal, that you are going to, just exclude certain people who would want to vote for a left-wing idea, but just do not see themselves represented in the left-wing proposal that's being on offer. So it's kind of like a political party that's appealing to the people who are already agreeing with them, kind of preaching to the choir. So there might be a problem with this just being a general campaign strategy, because you're not attracting the entire left-wing span that you could try to attract. And I think, unfortunately, in most of European countries, the radical right-wingers will almost always outnumber the radical left-wingers. This is a losing battle if we're going radical idea against radical idea. I think, like, most of the time. So that's one point. And the other point, I was just meaning to mention the pressure, the principle of pressure. Sometimes I feel like maybe some of the methods that you mentioned in the principle of pressure are still somewhat rationalistic. They're not manipulative enough. Right? I have the sense that sometimes when you're talking to the fascist uncle, that he might still see you as an adversary if you try to use those kinds of methods. Maybe one part of the conversation is just to have him feel like you're happy to talk to him, that you're happy to listen to his views, that you're happy to expose yourself in your views in some capacity, that there's a negotiation between you. Because I think like the principle of pressure is mostly applying to focusing upon his views rather than having a sort of a reciprocal conversation. So I kind of have the sense that whenever I was being able to talk sense to a radical right-wing person, it was mostly trying to just trying to find some very small common space where we can understand each other, just to show a kind of friendship and civility, to be able to see the other person as respectful. And I am not seeing that in the principle of pressure.
So thanks. Sorry, I'm coughing a lot, but I'm just catching all the germs that my son brings back from nursery. So two very interesting questions. So let me start from the second one, because I think that it's a really legitimate question, but it's also based on my kind of misrepresentation of the duty of pressure for a matter of times and presentation. But I think that so your point about being willing to listen to your interlocutor and also being willing to be moved by some of their concerns is really this is something that we can, in a more kind of a formal and academic version of all of this, we argue, right? So rhetoric is respectful and so it's not manipulative only when you are willing to be moved by the other, right? So in exercising pressure, what we also argue is that you need to be willing to listen to the concerns and demands of the other part and be moved by some of these demands, which doesn't mean that you are going to become far right and say, oh yes, you know what, yeah, let's burn all migrants. No, okay, not that. But for example, you can think that, well, maybe some of their socio-economic concerns are real concerns and you should rethink about them, right? So that's absolutely, I'm totally on board with that. So moderating copycatting. Sorry, I'm not sure that by being a radical, you are necessarily appealing to a part of the electorate that's already voting for you. So some studies, for example, about the electorate on the far right stress that many people that used to vote for communist parties or very left-wing parties then turn far right. So these were people who had some serious socio-economic concerns, right? And there is, I think, there is something to be said in favor of the story that left-wing parties have kind of given up on class politics, or some part of class politics, to go for other kind of issues instead of combining the two, right? And I think that changing the conversation and bringing those issues more to the fore. So again, I'm not sure whether it's gonna be successful at that point, but I was very impressed by the strategy of the new leader of the Democratic Party in Italy, who at least tried to change the conversation. And instead of talking about migration and minorities, she really focused, especially at the beginning, on the problem with work, the problem with precarious and unsafe work, the problem with a public healthcare system that is not providing assistance to people. So those kind of issues, right? But where the main issues of the left. But also, if you look at the case of the UK, is also another interesting case, because Labour, by copycatting or trying also to appeal to the moderate, is actually losing lots of votes from younger generations, young women who are interested in bold solutions about climate change, environment, like kind of social reproduction issues and so on, right? So I'm not really sure that, these people are really voting for. I think that it's true that many moderate people are still voting for these more mainstream parties, but that's not enough.
Great,
I can let mine because a lot of the sectors.
okay, perfect. Then Mickey.
Thank you, Alasia. This is really great. So a preliminary point. Ever since I learned that Elizabeth Anderson's parents are Trump voters, I just realized that I think this whole project is just doomed to fail. So there's no way to convince right-wing voters to change their minds.
If you couldn't do it.
Yeah, then, I mean, and if like appealing to authorities, so it's like it seems that it doesn't work. Anyway, so of course this is just an isolated example. But I also see something in the so there's a danger that maybe I will put it a little bit differently, but so a follow-up point is that if there is this repeated trying to convince far-right voters about progressive issues, or just about trying to think in different frames than they usually do. Maybe it's not that they feel excluded, but it might be just extremely annoying for them. And it's like there is no way. So why would they? So the effect will not be that, oh yeah, maybe I should think differently. But what an annoying uncle I have, right? So it's like they just keep coming back with these progressive agendas, and it's just like, oh my gosh, let's try to eat some cake instead than engaging in a conversation with them. Also, I was fairly surprised that you mentioned analogies as being part of rhetorics. I think it's like, so in the way you framed it, so it's like, I think analogies, it's not that they are less rationalistic, it's just like they are less theoretical. So it's like, there is David Bunin has an amazing book on applied ethics, and in the introduction they say that, well, it's like doing ethics can be extremely, well, so you can do it with very, very rudimentary tools. You don't have to understand the ethical theories to do that, and it's like one of the main ways to do that is by recoursing to analogy. So think about Singer's child drowning in a pond. So that's I wouldn't call that rhetorics, even though it's supposed to be a persuasive. So that as well, and also I think there is research on, and maybe, but I think that's completely in accordance with what you say, is that I think there is research on that. You can, so for example, I think for research on when people start to be convinced about the problem of discrimination, if you put it in abstract terms or in statistical terms, that look at there are these vast majority, or I don't know, it's vast numbers of people are discriminated against, and discrimination is wrong. It might be less effective than telling an example from experience that you're in this and that situation with this and that concrete person, and that was so it makes it much more. You can kind of get in contact with, or so it's just touch you more, and
That's enough.
This Victor's laugh is the sensitive. Yeah.
If you want to have your own lecture, you can start it next time.
It's tomorrow. It's on Wednesday. So if you want to come, then you feel free to. Yeah. So, but then I see the point. So thank you. Yeah.
I'm sure that we will have the opportunity to keep talking about this. Okay. The first question is again about the value of repetition, right? So I think that again, so when people stress the importance of a repeated message, it's not so much about the fact that you need to become your ankle stalker and then following him everywhere, pesting him, but more about having different people telling you, different people you know, you trust, you have a relationship with, kind of pressing you, right, and repeating the same message. But it's also been proven that repetition really works with a certain kind of voters of the far right. So again, the electorate of the far right is very heterogeneous and very complex. So we tend to have a stereotypical view of the voter of the far right, but things are much, much more complex. So repetition can particularly work, I mean, it doesn't necessarily work with a full-blown white supremacist, okay? But it might work with someone who is tempted to vote for Trump, maybe has voted him, he doesn't really know what to do. So like, people who then end up support the far right, but they're not like full-blown, kind of Nazis or whatever, right? I think that in that case, what works is the type of engagement that Alesia talks about more than anything else. If something works, okay? So analogies. So the reason why, I think when people think about analogies as belonging to rhetoric, what they have in mind is that with analogies, you don't make clear and explicit all these steps of the argumentation. You don't really take care of making sure that the kind of comparison you draw is really sound. So take the example of this discrimination that Christians face in Saudi Arabia and Salvini proposal of banning the construction of a new mosque. So the analogies puts the two together, saying they are actually the same thing. So if you're against the former, you need also to be against the latter. But it doesn't really go through all the passages saying whether the discrimination is really the same. So if a ban on the construction of mosques, for example, will really prevent Italian Muslim citizens to have access to to have like sites where they can practice their religion, is it really the same type of discrimination? So all of that is left very opaque, because what you are interested in is in the association. So it's not rationalistic in that way, where you just go step by step, right? And you kind of take care of the comparison. I totally agree with your point about arguments from experience rather than statistics. I mean, as you were saying, like it's been proven that numbers don't matter. It's not that if you're gonna, just throw numbers, statistics to people are gonna be convinced. What you need is narratives, stories, experience, potentially images, anything else will engage them. You're not gonna be engaged and convinced by numbers. As horrible as they may be, right? So.
Excellent. We have another question here.
Well, it's not really a question, but it's not going to be a lecture. You don't have to be afraid. Okay, I have two things that I would like to ask you.
Yeah.
Far right and Muslim is not the same.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, so we agree upon that. But the President Trump is egomaniac, and he's just a picture of the American society because he won this election. So you cannot connect him with the far right as well, because he doesn't have a party. He is an individual who unfortunately won. Sorry, that's it.
Sorry, I'm keeping coughing, but yes, so I agree, like the far right and the radicalization of Muslim citizens or other kind of religious citizens are not the same. So the reason why I brought it up is that that's been the other case that it's been in the mind of many people interested in radicalization, right, of citizens in so-called liberal democracies. But I agree with you that they're not the same, and that's why I think that some strategies of the radicalization that have worked and have proven to be very effective in one case might not work in the other. Or again, we cannot be so quick at assuming that they will. So I totally agree with that. Trump, okay. It's an interesting case, right? So in the case of the US, because of how the political system is structured, this is a very interesting case of a party that was not far right, be led by a populist radical right, far right, kind of leader. So I think that it still makes sense to talk about the far right when it comes to Trump, because of the way in which it's shaping the direction of the party by the Republicans, who have, if you kind of read histories of US politics, there has been a trend, right, in of course, in the Republican Party to go more towards the right? So, and of course that happened during the Reagan era, when Reagan started to appeal to evangelics and religious extremists. Before that time, the two parties actually were much closer on many issues, right? So, for example, when it came to abortion, right, abortion was, before Reagan, was a kind of transversal issue. So you will find like Republicans being in support of safe legal abortion, which then hadn't been the case after Reagan, right? So I think that Trump is an interesting case of how a party who was not a far-right party has become one, right? And the fact that the Republicans have not really fought against him, right? So that was a failure of a party, right? What was at least a mainstream party, not to oppose internally to his candidacy, especially after the first election, so in the second round. So yeah, thank you so much.
We have two more questions and then we will have to wrap it up. So the first question is here. Okay, so we have one question.
As a queer man myself, I often find dressing is very important not to get killed. And a lot of things that you talk about is very founded on understanding and communities and so on and so on. But how do we stop people killing people over these minor infractions in morality, if you ask them?
Yes, that's a very important question. I mean, in a sense, I wish I knew how to do that. Again, I think that it's important to understand kind of where violence comes from, right, and the kind of roots of violence. But I think that in general, like activists involved in, again, like prevention of violence, for example, will tell you a similar story about the importance of engagement and inclusion of some kind, right? And how violence often is the kind of channel of anger and frustration that comes from elsewhere. So I'm afraid I don't have a clear answer about how to stop that. But again, I think that much of what we've been discussing this evening will be also important for that.
Thank you so much. With that, I think we can wrap it up. We've been listening and discussing and participating for over an hour and a half. So I would like to thank you, Alasia, for your very inspiring talk. And of course, I want to thank our discussants who, because of your questions and your activity, actually didn't have a lot to do, but I'm glad that they actually started and introduced the discussion, and that's great. We always have them for this. Thank you very much for shaping the second 45 minutes of our joint time here with your questions, your comments, and so on. And I would like to invite you, those who are interested, to participate in a 4-day conference that starts tomorrow at the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences in Rijeka. We'll have many international guests. Dr. Alasia Nuti is one of them. But also we'll have Manin Katala from Canada, from the University of Montreal. And also many other interesting speakers discussing digital technologies, their effects and their impact on democracy, and many other related and important philosophical, political, and social topics. So, not to take too much time, thank you once again for being here, for your participation, your questions, and we will continue with our activities, maybe 1 or 2 lectures even before the summer break, and then we'll start strong in the autumn, probably by the end of September or early October, with new lectures, new presentations, new workshops, and other interesting activities. Thank you so much and have a pleasant evening.
Yeah, I just also wanted to thank everyone, and it's been really a pleasure to discuss these ideas with you, and thanks even Helvi for inviting me to give the public lecture, so thanks.